It's time to get to the special moment of the evening, and I don't know about all of you, but this has been an unbelievable event. For those of you who are EA members or who have not been here or participated, we try to throw museum events on a regular basis and have very special, memorable evenings like tonight, and I'd encourage you to, if you haven't continued to support EA, that you think about doing that going forward, because that's what allows us to be able to throw these types of events and special evenings. And this one is truly special, and it's a memorable event from a record standpoint. We have over 800 people here tonight for this special Wright Brothers Memorial event. And of course, I believe it's because of our speaker tonight. What I'd like to do first is this session is going to be moderated by somebody that's a very close personal friend and very special to EA. Charlie Precourt, who is our EA's vice chairman of the board and supports me in many, many ways that allows me to functionally run the organization, but more importantly, know that I have somebody watching my six and ensuring that the organization can continue to sustain itself if anything were to happen. Let me just go through Charlie's background briefly. Charlie's a vice president and general manager of propulsion systems at Northrop Grumman, which was formerly ATK. It was acquired by Northrop Grumman last year. He's responsible for key programs including solid rocket booster for the NASA Space Launch System, the Trident II, and the Minuteman II strategic missile product lines. He's currently working on the Omega-A heavy lift rocket, and talking with him at dinner tonight, he's also getting into the hypersonic work that will be very important to our future as a nation. Charlie's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy with a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering. He served 23 years with the U.S. Air Force, retiring as a colonel. He graduated from the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base and flew as a test pilot on the F-15E development program and many, many other programs at Edwards during those times. When he left the Air Force, he had a 15-year career at NASA. He qualified as a space shuttle astronaut in 1991, and he's a veteran of 4 space flights, 1 as a mission specialist, 1 as a pilot, and 2 as the mission commander. Now, for those of us who are always trying to achieve as many flight hours we can get, think about this. Charlie has logged over 932 hours just in space. Charlie was was the pilot on the first space shuttle mission to dock with the Russian space station Mir. He's held several management positions at NASA, including Deputy Program Manager of the International Space Station, Chief of the Astronaut Corps, and Director of Operations for NASA at the Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, Russia. He's a member of the Astronaut Hall of Fame, and he's EA through the Corps. In 1997, he had the first flight on the Very Easy that he built himself. We're very, very fortunate to have somebody with Charlie's background as an EA member and on our board of directors. So welcome, my vice chairman, Charlie Precourt.
Well, thank you, Jack. That was really kind. And with all that said, I think my role this evening is to be the best David Hartman that I can be, because I am extremely privileged to help moderate this evening's discussion with Frank Borman, who is a hero of all of ours, and he has such a fascinating story. So it is a delight for me to be here with you this evening. You know, I followed into my career because of Frank and his colleagues and what they have done. Frank, obviously, Air Force fighter pilot, test pilot, came out of Edwards Air Force Base to join the astronaut program. And of course, tonight we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of what I consider one of the most incredible missions ever to be considered for spaceflight. So for the run of the show, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Frank to come to the stage with me. And come on up, Frank. And what we talked about the other day was, as you know, Jim Lovell was going to join us and was unable to. I was going to moderate a panel discussion, and Frank quipped over the phone, well, I guess it won't be much of a panel if it's just me and you. But we're going to have fun with this. And I'm going to ask Frank to join us in the middle seat here, and I'm going to sit on the far side, and we'll just have a great conversation. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you. Sit down, sit down.
All right, so I think, Frank, the first thing I'd like to do is have the audience understand your connection to EAA. You know, this afternoon we opened your exhibit, and it's just phenomenal. And you and I talked a little bit about this on the phone, and your connection to EAA goes back quite a ways. You've exhibited vintage and warbirds here many times, including winning some awards with some of them. You've participated in a lot of educational outreach with the youngsters and joined us for the Apollo reunion in 2017. So what is it about EAA that compels you to be a part of this?
I think anybody that loves aviation has got to respect and enjoy being a part of the EAA. I started coming here in the 80s, and I've had several airplanes here. We won grand champion twice, once with the P-51 and once with the P-63. But to me, it's the fact that EAA does so much for general aviation. Be honest with you folks, if you promise not to tell anybody, I much prefer airplanes to spacecraft. Much. I don't know how you feel about it.
I'm with you. It's because we get to fly them more often, right?
That's right.
That's awesome. I know that we ought to first acknowledge your crew who couldn't be with us tonight, Jim and Bill. Would you like to say a few words about them as we get started?
Well, I was very fortunate to have Jim and Bill on our crew. We'll get into it later, but we were assigned a very short training period, and these were two great guys. Of course, I was very familiar with Jim Lovell anyway, because he and I flew a 2-week mission on Gemini 7. Now, I want you to think of this now. 2 weeks in a volume smaller than the front seat of a Volkswagen Bug, sitting on an ejection seat, sharing all that with a sailor, for God's sake. I was sure glad to get out of there.
You know, I was going to ask you about that because I'll just tell you a quick story about my Navy experience. So it's really great that there's 2 Air Force guys on the stage, but we don't have a Navy guy here to pick on in real time. But I guess that's okay,
better.
right?
We can pick on him
anyway.
Yeah.
So I had this Navy guy that followed me. He came out to Edwards when I was flying at Edwards, and his name's Kent Rominger, and he followed me into the astronaut program 2 years behind me. And then he became chief astronaut after me, and now he works for me at Northrop Grumman. I can't get rid of the guy. And I feel like one of my expertise that I've developed in life is to pick up after the faux pas of all these Navy guys. Does that remind you of anyone?
Well, it's, you know, when you're in an experience like that, you either become very good friends or bitter enemies. And Jim and I became dear friends. I remember we spent a great deal of time just drifting because we didn't have much fuel. And there was a popular country song at that time called "Put Your Sweet Lips a Little Closer to the Phone," and let's pretend that we're together all alone. And Lovell and I sang that for 2 weeks. And toward the end of the mission, somehow in that small place, we lost one toothbrush, so we shared a toothbrush. Now, if that isn't friendship, you tell me what.
That's friendship. But we do love to have our little debates with the Navy guys, and with Kent Rominger at the company, we like to entertain our employees with Navy Air Force stories, and the rivalry goes way, way back, of course. Tonight, the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8 should be our central focus, but Frank, I thought before we got into that, since this audience loves flying so much, can you tell us a little bit how you got your start in aviation and how all that transpired?
Yes, I grew up in Tucson. I was born in Gary, Indiana, but I got very sick, sinus, and my parents moved to Tucson. But while we were in Gary, my dad took me up for a ride, a typical old, you know, I'm an old guy here. It was the farmer's field in a Waco, and I got to ride in the front seat of a Waco on a $10 flight, which was a lot of money in that era. But it just sort of hooked me. And then my aunt worked at Wright Field, and one of her friends there was an Air Force officer, an Air Corps officer named Hagenberger, who was the navigator on the first flight from the coast to Hawaii. And he gave me a book called The Red Eagle. I still have that, and I bet I read it 1,000 times. While other kids were worried about Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and all that other nonsense. I was reading Red Arrow, and it was. I was very fortunate.
And then you went to the military academy and
Yeah, I got out. I wanted desperately to be a pilot, but I got out of high school in '46, and all the people returned from the war. There was not a great need for pilots in that time period. So I was working with a judge's son who was having a little trouble, almost not quite a juvenile delinquent, but this judge called me up and he said, I understand that you build model airplanes. Would you consider working with my son and teach him how to build them? And he said, I'll buy the airplanes. So I got to build airplanes with this young man, and it worked out real well. And one day he came in and he said, I understand that you want to be a pilot. And I said, yes. He said, well, a good friend of mine has a third alternate's appointment open at West Point because the third alternate man decided he wanted to be a dentist. Would you like to apply? And I said, well, yes, I'd love to, but I got 3 guys ahead of me, but let's go. And by the grace of God, I was the other people either decided they didn't want to go or they flunked, and I made it. So that's how I ended up.
That's fantastic. So for the audience, as we get into this, you'll notice I think there's on the screen an invitation for you to send questions in, because towards the end of the evening, we'll take questions from you all. But please send those on in, and we got somebody behind the curtain back there that'll provide those for us. So then you flew fighter aircraft in the Air Force prior to going to Edwards, I guess, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I went to traditional, but we started out in T-6s as the basic trainer, and then went to T-28s and F-80s.
Okay.
I went through Nellis, combat crew training. That was, our commanders at this time were all veterans of World War II, and they had a different value, put a different value on a human life. If you weren't losing people, the theory was you weren't training realistically. While we were at NASA, we were losing 2 airplanes a week on an average basis for over a year. And it was a very demanding time. The Korean War was on. And unfortunately for me, on one of the last missions there, on a dive-bombing mission, I burst an eardrum. And by then, instead of sending the replacements direct to Korea, they were sending to Japan, Okinawa, or the Philippines. And I got sent to the Philippines, but I got to go on a boat. And I tell you what, if you want a really miserable time, cross the Pacific in a boat going 14 knots. Took us 21 damn days to get there. But I reported into the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron to one of the most remarkable men I've ever met. He was a Tuskegee Airman named Charles McGee. I revere that man to this day. And there were 3 of us standing there, second lieutenants, I still remember. I told you these World War II guys were different, but we were sitting there saluting, and he's sitting behind his desk, and he looks up and he said, now, gentlemen, you've heard the story, I'm sure, in organizations where they say, you play ball with me, and I'll play ball with you. He said, here's how we do it in the 44th. You play ball with me, or I'll ram the bat up your ass. That was my introduction.
Kind of sets the expectation, doesn't it?
He was a wonderful man.
I guess you were spared the baseball bat. What was the pathway then to Edwards from there? How did that work out?
Say again?
You went to Edwards from there, I guess?
Well, no, as I said, I was permanently grounded. So I spent a lot of time at the flight surgeon's office telling, let's do something for my ear. And they looked, every time I'd go there, I'd say, you can't do anything about it. And then they cut orders in Washington, grounded me for sure. And so I volunteered to go into the Army. But Korean War was on, and I was a graduate at West Point. Well, they turned that down. And I tried to go to Korea as a forward air technical, but I hadn't any combat, so I couldn't do that. So I'd really given up. I thought, I'd done my best, and I went home to my wife, who was pregnant and had about a 1-year-old son. And I told her, I said, look, Susan, I've done my best. I can't get back on flying. When my tour is over, I'll just get out of the Air Force. I'll be an aeronautical engineer, and that's it. And God bless her, she looked at me, even though she knew this was a very dangerous job, she said, "You will not quit. I won't let you quit. Flying means too much to you." And it was her suggestion. She said, "You go see Major McGee, the 44th, and tell him you want to flight." So I went to see Major McGee again, the Batman, and I explained the situation to him, and I told him that I was under orders not to fly. And the first thing that man said was, "Let's get an airplane and go fly." So he took me up, and we depressurized the T-33, and my ear still is it's not normal, but it worked all right. And then came back, and I went to see the flight surgeon, and he said, "I told you can't fly. It's still the same. You got one play that's healed, but you know it's going to break if you ever going." And I told him that I'd flown, and he wasn't too happy, but at least he was a decent guy, and they put me back on flying status, so my career was saved at that
Awesome.
time.
Pretty neat story. Thanks to all of us that happened, because
That was close.
it was indeed. And then from that assignment, did you go to Edwards after that, or?
No, after that I came back to the zone of interior, and I was an instructor pilot in the Air Force Instrument Pilot School at Moody.
Yeah.
And then I went through the Fighter Weapons School, and I was an instructor in the Fighter Weapons School at Luke. And then I wish I could tell you, this was a different Air Force than we have today. I got a telegram one day while I was at Luke, and it said, "You've been assigned as an assistant professor at the military academy. Go get a degree, and you're going to come back. You're going to teach thermodynamics and fluid mechanics." So I went to see my boss at Colonel Childs, and I showed him the envelope, the telegram. I said, "Colonel, I don't want to do this. You told me that I'm doing a pretty good job here. I'm a fighter pilot. I certainly don't want to go back to school." And he looked at me, and again, it wasn't any of this touchy-feely stuff then and there. He looked at me. He said, "Borman, do you remember when you raised your hand on the plane and committed your heart to the country?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, you didn't only give him your heart, you gave him your ass. Get out of here." And I went and got a degree. And then I taught for 3 years at West Point.
Okay.
And then while I was at West Point, I figured I got the background now. I applied for the Air Force School.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, interestingly enough, when you were there, you got to work for Chuck Yeager some, I guess, huh?
Yeah, Yeager was the commandant of the test pilot school.
Yeah.
And he's a wonderful guy. I really enjoyed working for him, but he's a piece of work. You need to understand that. And one of the things about it that was wonderful, he was very well respected in the Air Force, and anything we wanted, he got for us. He was a good man to work for.
So can you talk a little bit about how some of that formed a baseline for decision-making later? You were part of the accident investigation on Apollo 1. You had a lot of risky missions to undertake. What can you say about the preparations you got there
Well, I
leading
think
up to that?
we had started, 4 of us or 5 of us had started what we called a graduate program at the Test Pilot School, the Air Force Research Pilot School. And we sort of taught our way through a curriculum at which I was in charge of the flying training, and we tried to simulate as much as we could the flying that would give these people a different environment than they'd ever been in an airplane. One of the flights that we did, one of the programs, was a Zoom flight in a 104. The 104 was a fantastic airplane if you wanted to go fast straight, but wasn't worth much for that. But we'd go in at 42,000 at Mach 2.2 and then pull up to about 45 degrees, and around 65,000 your afterburner would blow out. Then about 75,000 you had to shut the engine down, and then it went over the top, usually about 90,000 feet, and then a pressure suit. So it gave them a new experience and a certain amount of a pucker factor. So,
Slightly.
and then you came
Isn't
back
that
down.
the profile that Chuck Yeager ended up jumping out of?
Yeah, then we decided that 90,000 feet wasn't enough, that we ought to modify a 104 and put reaction controls on it and get up to where there's really no atmosphere. So we built they got the Air Force to approve the NF-104, which was a 104 with reaction controls, and a rocket on the tail end. I think it was a 6,000-pound rocket. It was, and one of the test pilots, a man by the name of Smith, got that up to 121,000. And then General Yeagers decided that he wanted to set a altitude record in it. So without any flying in the simulator or preparation, because if you all didn't know it, I want you to understand that he is the world's greatest pilot.
Of course.
Yeah. Just ask him.
Yeah.
And he got it in a spin and then bailed out, and that was the end of the program. Well, if the world's greatest pilot can't fly it, how can a normal mortal fly it?
So speaking of all that, though, of course, the movie The Right Stuff came out, and it talked about how many of the test pilots were being recruited into NASA for the Mercury program. And the thing that I chuckle about, and maybe I shouldn't be, because maybe it's real, you can tell us, that the medical examination that you all had to go through, and blowing through the tube and holding a ping pong ball in suspense for as long as you can and whatnot. I didn't have to do that when I got checked out. Was that? Tell us about that.
The medical examination at NASA was not as bad for us, the second 9, as it was for the first 7, but it was bad enough. They had enough doctors in there to sink a ship. And I was worried to death with my ear, as you all can imagine, and I never will forget, God bless this old Navy captain from Pensacola. He was an ear, nose, and throat guy, and he looked in that ear and he called me young man. He said, "Well, young man, you got a mighty interesting ear here." And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Does it bother you?" I said, "No, sir, not a bit." He said, "Well, if it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother me." That's my kind of a doctor.
That's awesome.
I learned later on, maybe you did too, though, you never trust a doctor doing research.
Exactly.
Because they treat you like a lab rat.
Absolutely.
They wanted me to take off on Gemini 7 with a probe in an artery so they could measure the arterial pressure. And fortunately, at least at that time, I don't know how it is later on, but we could tell them to pack it in. I didn't.
Well, that's why we had mission specialists and payload specialists. Those poor guys had to sit in the back deck, and they did have them all wired up with blood syringes and all kinds of stuff. But was Dr. Hind one of the staff doctors there when you were there? So you can imagine what he does based on the last name he had. He was a jewel.
I don't know. Well, listen, the place was full of jewels, I'll tell you.
So the first time you met Jim was on the Gemini mission, or flew with him anyway. You obviously had gotten together much.
I met Jim Lovell. He was in our group of 9. And, we're becoming aware the first 7 are all dead, and 5 of our group are dead. And I guess the rest of us are, Jim couldn't be here tonight because he's had back surgery and his wife is quite ill. And Anders has had back surgery, and I need back surgery, but I'll be damned if I'm going to get it. So I don't know what the deal is. But anyway, Lovell and I were assigned on Gemini 7, and I'll tell you folks, most of the pilots didn't want to fly Gemini 7 because it was basically a physical flight. Nobody had flown for 2 weeks in space that long, and they wanted to determine how humans reacted to zero-G. Now it's nothing. You've had guys up for a year.
When I think about what you did on that mission, so the 14 days is longer than any of the 4 that I did. They were each 10 days, and he had about 1/6 the volume to operate in that we had on the space shuttle, and he had to be among the crew that were the first to experience a lot of the effects of weightlessness in long term that we didn't have to suffer through, because by then we had things like, for space sickness, we took Phenergan, the drug that they give pregnant ladies, so when they have morning sickness, we wouldn't have sickness in space, but you had to experience that for the first time.
One of the things about Gemini, though, you were strapped in all the time, so we didn't move around.
Right.
Neither one of us got sick.
Yeah.
But the doctors were trying to find a way to simulate zero-G, so that Lovell wore garters, pneumatic garters, and they would pulse on and off on the theory that your blood would have a hard time running back, and that your heart would think that it was in the 1G environment.
Yeah.
And because a lot of doctors have predicted that we'd die when you came back. Like I said, don't ever trust a doctor. But anyway, we're coming down afterwards in the parachute, and I looked at Lovell and I said, "Well, you gonna pass out?" And he said, "No, and neither am I." As a matter of fact, the effects on us. But the only thing I really noticed was the muscles in our legs were shot and we were stiff. I don't know how it was with them.
It was very similar. And,
Yeah.
and you know, the guys on space station today spend 3 hours a day exercising to try to avoid that.
Well, I'm going to tell you all another secret. There's no damn way you could get me up on that space station for a year. No way.
It's not for everybody,
They
is
need
it?
to have a different personality than I was. And listen, I admire them a great deal because
Yeah.
they're doing important
Well, it's
work.
what we're going to need for going to Mars, right?
Going to Mars,
You get
right.
committed to a mission like that, you're gone for a couple of years.
They just don't need me doing it.
But there was more to Gemini 7, and you were there with 6, right? You were trying to develop the first rendezvous capabilities.
Well, but our Gemini 7 factor for the rendezvous was simply to be an inner target, and then
Yeah.
Gemini 6 was. This again, though, was the hallmark of NASA at that time period. The Gemini 6, you know, the rocket had failed, and again, it was really Wally Schirra, the good old naval test pilot. Instead of following the mission rules and ejecting, he sat still, and they were able to recycle it in 2 weeks, and we became the target, and that's what happened. I just can't think. I remember when the Agena blew up that 6 was supposed to rendezvous with. The first thing that the people and the engineers in NASA were talking about, well, how do we make this? You know, you hear the deal that the Apollo program was a great scientific explorer, and it was. But the main thing it was a battle in the Cold War.
Right.
Everybody there was focused on meeting the president's demand to beat the Russians to the moon in 10 years. And so it was wonderful. It was a great place to work. From the top to the bottom, everybody was well motivated. And if you weren't motivated, you weren't there.
That's a lesson for us today when you think about having a mission and a sense of urgency and getting us back to the moon again. We have the inspiration. We just got to get the urgency again.
Well, every president since Kennedy has talked about going to Mars. And they talk big and they make all kinds of promises and they never fund it. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that there's ever going to be the same emphasis on national security that there was in the Russians program. But I do think that a well-funded and thought-out program to explore Mars makes a lot of sense. And I firmly believe and that the ideas that you hear now about colonizing Mars and this escape mechanism, I think that's nonsense. The average temperature on Mars is something like -84.
Right.
And the atmosphere there is equivalent to about 100,000 feet here. There's no way you're going to have a colony there. But it makes good press and hype. But in my opinion, there still ought to be in my opinion, there ought to be a well thought out and funded program to put probably a small space science colony on Mars, like South Pole.
Yeah, like we have at the McMurdo station
Yeah.
on the South Pole, right? With research objectives
Yeah.
and so forth, yeah.
But you hear the deal, what's this guy's name, the automobile guy, Musk?
Yeah.
And he's going to have colonies up there in the 20s. Oh, my goodness. Wonder what world he lives in.
So maybe a little known fact about the Gemini 6-7 rendezvous. There was this sticker in the window that kept getting pictures of that said something about beat Army. What was that all about? Was that that Navy thing again?
Well, here I am. You guys you all ought to sympathize with me. Here I am flying with Lovell, who's a Naval Academy graduate, and both Stafford and Schirra are Naval Academy graduates. So as they pull up in their spacecraft, there's a big sign in the window, "Beat Army." But I was smarter, as most West Pointers are smarter than the Naval Academy guys by a long shot. Instead of saying "Beat Army," I said, "Oh, look at the sign. It says Beat Navy."
But when you were rendezvoused like that, you did close-in formation flying for quite a while too, right?
It was the autopilot or the controls on the Gemini mission, on the Gemini spacecraft were fantastic. I'm sure they were on the shuttle
Well,
too.
we learned all that from you, and I remember when we did the first docking of Atlantis to the Mir, I went to John Young and said, "Hey, tell us about your experience. What did you worry about And by then, the flight controls were so refined, it was a piece of cake to fly.
Well, you could fly within 12 feet of 12 inches of each other. There's no atmosphere, so there's no perturbation.
Right.
It really was a piece of work, piece of cake.
But we didn't know until you guys proved it out.
Well, neither did we, but it worked out easy. Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit, just a little bit about astronaut life. You know, we didn't fly very frequently, and it was the same for you. But you were assigned to jobs in between. What did you have? I know you were the astronaut assigned to the Apollo 1 fire, but you had other technical roles to help move the program along in between flights as well, right?
One of the fortunate things for the country and for NASA was unfortunate for Deke Slayton. He got grounded by the wonderful doctors because he had a fibrillation. But as a result of that, he ended up being, like you were, in charge of the astronaut office. And Deke brought incredible integrity and dedication to that job. And I don't recall anybody ever saying, oh, you know, complaining about his assigning crews or anything else. It was Deke Slayton, in my opinion, was one of the giants of the program, and he did a great job. So I don't know how anybody else did, but I got signed. My first assignment was on Gemini 3. I was going to be Gus Grissom's co-pilot. So Slayton said, why don't you go meet, I didn't know Gus from Adam, but he said, why don't you go over to his house on Sunday and talk to him? So I went over in the afternoon on Sunday afternoon and talked to Gus, and I guess I said something he didn't like because Monday I wasn't a co-pilot anymore. And so, okay, he doesn't want me, I don't want him. And then I ended up finally on Gemini 7.
But you had so many things that were dynamic in that time too. The crews were being, you know, you used backups. We didn't do that on shuttle, and you would move crews around as the missions were changed. Right?
Well, Slayton developed a sequence. If you were a backup on one crew, three missions later you would prime. I was backup with Jim Lovell on Gemini 4, and then we flew Gemini 7, and then I went on to Apollo, and Lovell flew as a commander on Gemini 12, I believe.
Okay.
But he had a sequence, and he stuck to it. I want you to know that I really respect these people like Slayton and some of the other giants over there.
So then you had to transition into a new spacecraft, come out of Gemini to go to Apollo, and we had the unfortunate accident with Apollo 1. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned, and you in particular being on the accident investigation? There was a big turning point, and you think about the time frame, it just is mind-boggling to me. So January 67, we have the fire, but by December of 68, you're orbiting the moon, and by July of 69, we're on the surface. And that's an incredible recovery, given the nature of the challenge, right?
It was an incredible recovery. There's no question that the fire set us all back.
Yeah.
And it was a credit to the head of NASA, Jim Webb. He was able to hold the Congress off from investigating until we had investigated it, NASA itself. And he appointed the head of the Langley Spacecraft Center, a man by the name of Floyd Thompson, who was widely respected to be the head of the committee. And in my opinion, that was a stroke of genius from Webb's standpoint. Nobody did more to get us to the moon than Jim Webb, in my opinion. He was the head of NASA. The best, the first and the best there ever was. So it was a tortured recovery, but there was again the same deal that Dr. Gilruth and Weber replaced the program manager. The North American replaced all of the management team, and pretty soon we had a genius by the name of George Lowe, who took over his command as Apollo program manager and just did a remarkable job. He managed by setting up what he called a configuration control board. There was obviously, you had to make a lot of changes to the Apollo, but you didn't do it unless it got through the configuration control board. And as a result of that, I think they proposed and made over 1,000 changes, and it was done very rapidly. It was
that CCB, the Change Control Board, survived all the way through the shuttle program.
Did it really?
Yes, we did. We used it.
Well, that's George Lowe's contribution.
Yes, absolutely. And George, by the way, His son was a shuttle astronaut.
Yeah.
We called him G. David, and great individual, and what a legacy. You know, he was also instrumental in the decision to make the Apollo 8 flight that you did and the changes that were associated with that. Before you go into that, though, think about a little bit for the folks to understand the sequence. After Apollo 1, there was a build-up approach that was planned, right? You were going to do command service module, then a lunar module flight, and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about the plan that was there and then how it had to change?
The plan after the fire was that we'd have a Apollo flight just in Earth orbit with the command module only. Then the next flight, which would be Apollo 8, would be a lunar module, command module rendezvous in Earth orbit. And then I was assigned with Lovell and Anders to Apollo 9, which was really a repeat of 8, but in a higher orbit. And it soon became apparent that this wasn't going to work because the lunar module was way behind. It was the first ship through, and they are always slow. So George Low came up with the idea, well, we'll change the Apollo 8 mission to a Earth. His first proposal was a free return to Earth from around the moon. And Chris Kraft and his people came out, well, we're going all the way to the moon. We might as well go into lunar orbit, and that's how that happened. It was interesting because Lovell and Anders and I were out at North American going through tests with our spacecraft, which was Apollo 9. And I got a call from Slayton, and I got out of the spacecraft and went and talked to him. And he said, I need to talk to you, get back here. I said, well, Deke, I'm real busy. Tell me over the phone. And he reminded me who was boss. I want to emphasize there wasn't any touchy-feely in NASA at that time. So I hustled to the airplane and went back to Houston. And I knew something was up because when I walked in his office, he shut the door and he didn't even sit down. He explained to me what was going on and that Apollo 8 was going to go to the moon and I would be in charge of Apollo 8 if we wanted to do it, if our crew would accept it. So I accepted on the spot. And that's really, really how it happened. Some of the people that wrote books, oh, well, Borman acted like a Prussian because he committed his crew without asking them. That's like George Low said when we had decisions on the configuration control board. Low said, I didn't take any votes. I didn't ask for opinion. I asked for opinions, and then I made the decision.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway.
But that was also set in the backdrop of the Russians appearing to be ready to do Earth departure themselves, and
he told
the fact that the lunar module delay would have put us out into the 70s, right?
Yeah, Slayton told he said they had word from the CIA that the Russians were planning a circumlunar flight before the end of the year, and that's why they rushed up. I can't emphasize enough that the basis of this program was a Soviet struggle, beat the Russians. That was the overriding motivation.
So when you think about it, for me, that is probably the gutsiest move that we made, was to think about, here's where we are, just recovering from the Apollo fire, rejiggering the sequence to be able to get back on track to get to the moon before the end of the decade. And when you flew, you're the first flight of the Saturn V, you're the first crew to leave Earth orbit, the first to get on the backside of the moon, see the Earth rise, all these things that were firsts that, you know, the guts that it took to put all that together.
Well, I'll tell you what, again, if I sound like a broken record, I have such admiration for the people who were running NASA. Chris Kraft was the head of flight operations, and he got us all together. He got me and his team together. Usually putting together a flight plan, as you know, takes forever.
Right.
But in one afternoon, from 1 o'clock till 5 o'clock, we sat down with Chris and his people, and we came up with a flight plan in 4 hours. And again, it was Chris. He listened to everybody, and then he made the decision. I know that one of the things we argued about, I didn't want to take a TV camera. And I said, that's just going to be a distraction. My main purpose was to go orbit 10 times and get home, because that would beat the Russians, and that's what I was interested in. But Chris overruled me, and he was right. I was dumb, and we carried a TV camera. That was the way it was.
Well, take us through that mission sequence, and one thing that I'd point out that has struck me as impressive is John Young flew on 10 before 11, and he was, the continuity between Apollo and the shuttle program, having flown the first shuttle mission, and was a mentor of ours. And I'll never forget one afternoon we're sitting around in the conference room, and we got to ask him, what was it like the first time you did the TLI burn and you're headed away from Earth? And he said, well, he's got that Georgia accent. Well, I looked back and the Earth was getting smaller, and I was thinking, I sure hope this is good for science, because I'm not so sure it's good for John Young. So that stuck with me for obvious reasons. You were the first to see that.
John was one of a kind.
He was.
I don't know if he was still doing it, but he used to write younggrams about everything.
Yes, he did it all the way to the end. Yep. He would write memos about anything that was technically a concern to him. And this is an astronaut who had flown twice on Gemini, twice on Apollo, including 10, the low approach to the moon, and then 17 to land on the moon, and first flight of the shuttle. And I mean, he'd been around. And so when it was time for him to be in management, anything that was technically an issue, he'd write a memo and send it all the way up the chain. There were thousands of them.
And it was like popcorn.
It was. And everybody had to answer every detail in there before we'd fly the next flight. It was precious. But talk to us about that whole sequence of launch through the moon orbit.
Well, we were the first crew on a Saturn V. Well, still, I think the most powerful machine ever built.
Still.
You're building one that'll be bigger.
VSLS will be just a bit bigger, yep.
But one of my assignments was a crew safety for boost. And there were certain failure modes where the launch vehicle would do a hard over, and humans couldn't react fast enough to escape. So we had to put in a automatic system. And it was... this is the detail of engineering that went into that. The answer was, okay, we'll put in a rate gyro. If the rate gyro senses a hard over, away you go automatically. But then what happened if the rate gyro failed? Then you had okay, we'll put in 2 gyros. Oh, which one are you going to believe?
Yeah.
So we ended up with 3, and then we voted. If 2 said go, you went. It was that kind of detail that left me with the absolute confidence that launch vehicle was going to work, and it worked perfectly every time it was manned. Unbelievable.
So obviously this is coming into this season, coming into Christmas season, and you're all being launched on this mission. And I think PAO, we called them PAO in my time, Public Affairs Office at NASA, they're trying to coach the crews to, be able to connect with the folks on the ground. I think they told you to do something appropriate or something like that when it came to say something appropriate.
We had only 4 months to train for this new flight. I don't know how long it took you guys, but usually it was more than a year to train. So we were really busy. And when they came up with this idea of television programs, when I told you I didn't want to take a television camera, but they said, well, you're going to have one on Christmas Eve that will reach more people than has ever been reached in human history. And I said, fine, this to the head of NASA PAO, what do you want us to do? And the only instructions I got were this: do something appropriate. Can you imagine if I'd have been a Russian? We'd have been talking about Lenin and Stalin, and that sounds like a good deal, but then the 3 of us couldn't figure out what was appropriate. Now, I had a very good friend in Washington who was an intellectual and a refined man. I wrote him and said, hey, Cy, help me out. What's appropriate? He couldn't figure it out either, so after a couple of weeks, he turned to a friend of his named Joe Leighton, who was a war correspondent, had been a war correspondent, and was married to a French resistance lady who had been raised in that nunnery off the coast of France. She was a devout Catholic, and he couldn't figure out anything, and his wife came down about 4 in the morning and saw that Joe had wrapped up all these papers, and he'd gone through the Bible, and he couldn't find anything, and he was at the end of his table. And his wife said, look, why don't you just start at the beginning? And that's how Genesis came about.
Wow.
Cy wrote me back, to be honest with you, we all said, this is appropriate. We typed it in the flight plan and never thought a thing about it until we said it. So
Nice.
it was a, I want to tell you, when you looked at the moon, which is a terribly distressed landscape, I mean, the meteorites and the volcano, and then you looked at this beautiful blue planet we call home, you didn't understand this was extremely appropriate. So it was, I'd like to take credit for it, but I have a problem, I'm honest. So it belongs to Joe Layton and his wife.
It's a great story. There were a couple of pucker moments with the Burns being on the back side of the moon too, huh?
I think the most anxious time for me of the whole flight was what we called the trans-earth injection, which was about a 3-minute and 18-second burn, as I recall, from the back of the moon. And had it not worked, I'd still be circling the moon. And I'd much rather be here and be with you tonight. But again, I'd like to say it was superior piloting and a wonderful. The fact is, that spacecraft worked perfectly. It was nominal.
It's wonderful. You know, and he's right. That evening was Christmas Eve when you did the reading of the Genesis, and the numbers say that they estimate 500 million people were hearing it in real time. So quite a mark that it left on civilization at the time. And 1968 was not an easy year for the country, right? And this was an uplifting end-of-the-year moment for the country.
I think the country was as fragmented then as it is now, with the war in Vietnam and all the protesters at the Democratic Convention. But, and there were a lot of people by then that were, you know, why are we spending all money on this when we should be putting it in the slums and everything? That goes on today too, but it was a remarkable flight, and I can't take credit for it. The George Lowe's, the NASA management, and then I think there was a little bit of divine assistance too.
Certainly. Thoughts about where we're going with the future of the program? We alluded to that a little bit.
You probably know a lot more about that than I do. I myself, and I haven't kept up with it nearly the way you have, but it seems to me that it makes the right sense to try to go back to the moon first and try to understand how to survive with a scientific outpost on the moon.
I think the McMurdo Station model is a great one.
You're involved in fuel technology and everything, but I read in the paper, and it says, "Oh, look, they found moisture on the moon. We can make rocket fuel." And I'm going, "Huh?
Good luck."
Hooray! So I hope we get a well thought out, long-term program to explore Mars.
That's what we all hope for.
It's not going to be a trivial thing, because Bill Anders, who is a nuclear engineer, keeps telling me that the radiation is going to be a real problem.
It is.
And so.
But you know, the sustainability of it, the inspiration it gives to the next generation. The Apollo program inspired an entire upswing in aerospace and technology in the country, and I think what you've just described is the hook for the next generation to become even more involved in something that's sustainable. What kind of advice might you give to those who are considering a career in aerospace?
Well, I agree with you. Of course, you and I are prejudiced. We love it.
Right.
And the experience that I've had in working with the dedicated people that I've worked with was made just for a lifetime of satisfaction. As the pilots and the astronauts, you know too, we got all the notoriety, all the acclaim, but there were 400,000 people working on the Apollo program, and every one of them was as motivated as they could be. One of the tasks that we had was to visit different factories and talk about zero defects. I don't know if you still do that or not.
We do, yeah.
But I remember going through the Titan autopilot plant in Denver at about 1 in the morning, and this huge lady, I bet she weighed 300 pounds, she grabbed me, almost suffocated me, and she, "Don't you worry, young man, we're doing real good work here." And that pervaded everybody. It was wonderful.
You know, you remind me of an award that started in the Apollo program. We called it the Silver Snoopy Award. you know, we adopted the Snoopy character as kind of the mascot for the astronauts to recognize folks in the workforce who did something like you just described that was in the interest of the safety of the crews. And I think as 1% of the workforce each year gets recognized with a direct presentation of a pin from a crew member. And you guys started that, and it continues to motivate the workforce through this day. We do it all the time.
Well, I consider myself fortunate that I was part of it. I think it was an effort, a national effort that was akin to the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
And it was, every day, a NASA employee puts out what the history of spaceflight. And just today I was reading, it was something like the first flight of the Titan, and here this was in 1961 or something, and 4 years later I'm flying it. It's unbelievable.
It's amazing how fast you guys moved. It really is. How about we take a few questions from the audience? Chris, you're the man behind the curtain. Can you do that for us?
Absolutely. We have several questions here, and thank you guys for writing them in. One of which was, somebody said Captain Lovell was a great talker. Is it true that he talked all the way to the moon on Apollo 8?
No, listen, Jim and I are great friends, and I'm not going to tell on him, that's all. I will say this, on the way back, you know, Lovell got so that he could play that computer like a piano, and on the way back, he played it too well, or he hit a bad key, and he put in a program that had the spacecraft sense it was back on the launch pad.
Oh, that's right.
So when the autopilot started rotating it, it tumbled the gyros, and we lost our space
positioning.
Yeah, and so we were floating without any way to tell which way was to point the spacecraft. But he got it straightened out, and you know that's interesting too, because it shows you the way that NASA was working back then. One of the things that the mission rules had was you had the stable platform working with 3 gyros going. You took a reading and then pointed the spacecraft where it was supposed to be, did your burn, and then shut the spacecraft down. Shut the platform down to save power. Well, I've been flying enough. I know if I got something working good, the damn way I want to shut it down.
Right.
So I wrote a letter to the Apollo program office. I said, look, on Apollo 8, I want to leave it run the whole time. So they forwarded it to MIT, who built the platform, and back came a letter from the engineer that designed the platform. And he listed all the reasons you should shut it down, and all this and that, signed it. Below he said, P.S., if I were going on this mission, I'd let the damn thing run too. And that's the truth. I don't know what happened to that. Another time, I was out at North American on the engineering simulator. I pulled back on the hand control like you pull back on a stick or a yoke, and the nose went down. And I pushed forward on the reverse. I told the engineer, I said, hey, come on, you got the polarity reverse, fix it. And he said, oh no, this is the way you're gonna fly it. And I said, what? And, usually in an airplane, when you pull back, he said, but our human factors, people, our human factors, people, have determined you can do a better job if you fly the target. So when you pull back, you go down, but the target goes up. And well, that's interesting, but the human factors people aren't going on this flight. And I went right to the phone. I explained it to the Apollo program, and that afternoon it was fixed. That was the way NASA was then. They listened to the people that had the knowledge. It was great.
And we inherited that. We put crews on technical assignments like that because a lot of the engineers didn't have an appreciation for the environment we're going to operate in, and it was critical. And we inherited that directly from your program. What else you might have there, Chris?
David over at table 12 said that he saw your PPK on display and wondered what you took with you on Apollo 8 inside of those bags.
Well, we took some medallions. I don't know if you did that on the shuttle.
Yeah, the PPK is what we call the personal effects kit, and we would take, you know, little things for family and so forth.
It was the personal stuff that you took. But I know one of the things I took was a tack out of a hobnail from a friend of ours' husband, World War I boot. It was that type of thing, mostly light, small stuff.
I took the skate guards from my daughter's ice skates. So it was kind of anything. Ask the kids what they want to send to space, that's what you get. Chris?
Tom over at table 63 would like to know, Frank, first, thanks for joining us tonight. During Apollo 8, was there any moments you were able to take time and really appreciate what you were doing and your place in history on this mission?
No, I never thought about history. I don't think any of us did. The one time in the flight when we became, I think, nostalgic was on Christmas Eve when you looked back and you could see the Earth in the background over this terrible, tortured horizon. Interestingly enough, none of the photographic flight plan had anything to do with taking pictures of the Earth. And Bill Anders had meticulously put out and accounted for every exposure we had. But when we looked at the Earth, that flight plan went out the window, and he took the picture of the Earth with a 250 millimeter lens on a Hasselblad camera. And I think arguably you could say it's one of the most important pictures in history of it. But please, if you run into Anders, don't tell him I said that. He never lets me forget it every time I say him so.
One thing that impressed me, we're much closer to the Earth in the space shuttle missions, but the idea that you could actually see the three-dimensional spherical shape of the Earth, as opposed to, like, from the Earth, when we look at the moon, it has more of a flat appearance. When you were in the lunar orbit and you looked at the Earth, could you sense still with the human eye that it had a spherical shape floating in blackness?
It looked pretty flat to me.
Did it?
You know, those
probably
flat
the
Earth
distance
people may have a point there. I don't know.
Chris, maybe time for one more?
Absolutely. Let's see. Tom at table 37 wanted to know what was your favorite meal that you took into space with you?
Well, he's hit a sore point. You know, my idea, Charlie, I don't know what you, I wanted to have a mission that was successful, and the number one thing was to go there, do 10 orbits, and come home. That was it. And so consequently, NASA had provided new wet pack meals, but I said, no, we lived for 14 days on the old stuff, so we'll take that. And, but unbeknownst to me, they snuck in on Christmas dinner one of the new wet packs, and it was a wonderful meal. And Lovell and Anders still are upset because I didn't take that on the whole flight. But, you know, there are all kinds of people come out of the woodwork. For instance, one of the suggestions was that we depressurize the spacecraft, open up, and do some sampling of the on the way to the moon. And I'm thinking, this is nuts. Why would you do that? Our mission is to go to the moon and come home. And you know, I couldn't make those decisions unilaterally, but Kraft just looked at the guy and shook his head, and that was it.
Thankfully, right.
Frank, we have one question here. Do you have any predictions on the Army-Navy game tomorrow?
Ray! No, that's too close to talk about.
Okay, well, Frank, we really appreciate what you've done here for us tonight, and EAA really appreciates your support over the years. We're going to close with you have something else you want to share?
I appreciate the effort that you did. You know, he was the first one to dock with a Russian Mir, and he's got far more time in space than I do.
Well, it's only because of what you did, Frank.
You can get more if you volunteer for one of those year-long missions.
That's right. John Glenn made a comeback. Maybe I can. But I think what we'd like to do is close with a video of the Genesis part of your mission. And can you roll that, folks?
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Thank
What an
you.
inspiration.
Thank you. You're great.
Nicely
Thank
done.
you. Hang in there. Thank you. That's phenomenal.
Over this way.
After you.
Okay.